At 2:13 in the morning, while rain hammered against the glass walls of Blackridge Dynamics' 43rd floor, the most powerful tech company in Chicago was collapsing in real time. Red warning lights flashed across the server room. Engineers shouted over one another in panic. Millions of dollars were vanishing by the second as the company's revolutionary AI defense system crashed again, harder than ever before. Senior developers stared helplessly at screens filled with corrupted code, while executives demanded answers nobody could give. Then, in the middle of the chaos, someone noticed the janitor. Ethan Cole stood silently near the back of the room wearing a gray cleaning uniform, one hand still gripping a mop handle, his tired eyes locked onto the scrolling lines of code as if he understood every single error racing across the monitors. Nobody paid attention to him at first. Why would they? To them, he was just the night cleaner, the quiet single father who scrubbed coffee stains off conference tables and emptied trash bins after midnight. But then, the entire system failed. Every screen went black. The building froze in silence, and for one terrifying second, Blackridge Dynamics lost complete control of the network that had taken years to build. "We're done," one engineer whispered. "The contract is dead." That was when Ethan slowly stepped forward. "Your synchronization loop is overwriting the recovery packets," he said calmly. The room turned toward him in disbelief. A few engineers actually laughed. One of them cursed at security to remove him immediately. But Ethan ignored them. He walked straight to the terminal while alarms screamed through the building. The CEO himself, Nathaniel Reed, had just entered the room when he saw the janitor's fingers begin flying across the keyboard with terrifying speed. Lines of code streamed down the monitor faster than anyone could follow. Ethan's expression never changed, not even when security grabbed his shoulder. "Wait," Nathaniel ordered suddenly, something about the man's eyes stopping him cold. The room held its breath. Ethan rewrote an entire routing sequence in less than 60 seconds. Then he hit enter. Silence. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. Suddenly the monitors flickered back to life. Red warning signals turned green across every screen in the room. The servers stabilized. The AI system rebooted perfectly. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. The billion-dollar problem that Blackridge's greatest engineers had failed to solve for 6 months had just been fixed by a janitor making $15 an hour. Nathaniel stared at the exhausted man standing under the harsh fluorescent lights, the worn boots, the chemical stains on his sleeves, the wedding ring still hanging from a chain around his neck, and realized something impossible. He knew this man. Years ago, Ethan Cole had been one of the most brilliant system architects in America before he vanished from the tech world without a trace. And now, the same broken genius everyone forgot was standing in his building cleaning floors just to keep his little girl alive. The alarm on Ethan Cole's cracked phone rang at 4:37 in the morning, but he had already been awake for nearly an hour. Sleep had become a luxury he could no longer afford. He lay still on the worn-out couch in the tiny apartment, staring at the water stains spreading across the ceiling while listening carefully to the sound coming from the bedroom down the hall. Every parent knew the sound of their child breathing, but Ethan had learned something worse over the years. He had learned how to recognize danger in silence. The moment Lily's breathing changed, even slightly, his entire body reacted before his mind could catch up. He pushed himself off the couch quietly and walked toward the bedroom, the floor creaking under his weight. The apartment was freezing again. The heater had stopped working 3 weeks earlier, and the landlord kept promising to send someone soon. Ethan couldn't afford to argue anymore, not after the overdue rent notice taped to the front door yesterday morning. He opened the bedroom door slowly. Lily was asleep under 3 blankets, her tiny chest rising unevenly. The soft wheezing sound made his stomach tighten instantly. Ethan moved beside her bed and gently adjusted the inhaler resting near her pillow, making sure it was within reach if another attack started during the night. For a moment, he just stood there watching her. 8 years old, Too young to understand why her father skipped meals so she could eat. Too young to understand why he always smiled, even when his eyes looked exhausted. Too young to know that the electricity would probably be shut off by the end of the week if he couldn't somehow come up with another $400. Lily stirred slightly and opened her eyes. "Daddy?" she whispered sleepily. Ethan forced an immediate smile onto his face. "Hey, Peanut, go back to sleep." "You didn't sleep again." "Sure I did," she frowned weakly. "You're lying." Ethan laughed softly under his breath because she sounded exactly like her mother whenever she caught him pretending things were okay. God, he missed her. Some nights the grief hit him so hard he could barely breathe himself. 3 years had passed since Emily died, but the emptiness she left behind still lived inside every corner of the apartment. Her coffee mug remained untouched above the sink. Her winter coat still hung beside the door because Ethan couldn't bring himself to move it. After she died from a sudden autoimmune illness, the hospital bills destroyed everything they had left. Then his tech startup collapsed 6 months later after investors pulled out during a lawsuit Ethan never saw coming. One disaster after another, like life had decided to bury him while he was already on his knees. "Daddy?" Lily's tiny voice pulled him back. "Are we okay?" Ethan looked at his daughter and felt the familiar ache in his chest. She asked that question more often lately. Kids always knew more than adults thought they did. He sat beside her and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "Yeah," he lied gently. "We're okay." "Promise?" Ethan hesitated for half a second before nodding. "Promise." She smiled weakly and closed her eyes again, trusting him completely. That trust crushed him more than any failure ever could. Because Ethan honestly didn't know how much longer he could keep the promise alive. By 6 in the morning, he was already driving across downtown Chicago in his 15-year-old Honda, delivering packages for a courier app that barely paid enough to cover gas. Snow mixed with rain slammed against the windshield while the heater blew cold air into his face. He skipped breakfast again, telling himself coffee was enough. It wasn't. Nothing was enough anymore. Around noon, his phone buzzed while he carried a heavy printer box into an office building. The screen displayed St. Mary's Pediatric Clinic. Ethan's heart dropped instantly. He answered before the second ring. "Mr. Cole," the receptionist said carefully, "we need to discuss Lily's medication refill." The insurance denial came through again. Ethan closed his eyes. Of course it did. "How long do we have?" "Her current inhaler should last maybe another week." Another week. Ethan leaned against the wall, exhaustion flooding through him like ice water. "I'll figure something out." "I'm sorry," the receptionist said softly. Ethan thanked her anyway because he knew she was trying to help. But when the call ended, he stood completely motionless for several seconds while office workers passed him carrying expensive coffees and laughing about lunch meetings. Nobody looked at him twice. To them, he was invisible, just another tired delivery driver in a wet jacket. By evening, Ethan's body already felt like it was breaking apart, but his second shift hadn't even started yet. At 7:45 p.m., he parked outside Blackridge Dynamics for the first time. The skyscraper towered above the city like something untouchable, its glass exterior glowing against the darkening skyline. Ethan stared at it through the rain-covered windshield. Years ago, he used to walk into buildings like this wearing tailored suits and carrying presentations worth millions of dollars. Back then, people shook his hand when he entered a room. Back then, his opinions mattered. Now, he sat in silence wearing borrowed work boots and a janitor's uniform with another man's name poorly stitched over the chest pocket. Martin. The cleaning supervisor hadn't even bothered getting him a proper replacement yet. Ethan took a slow breath before stepping out into the freezing rain. Inside the building, everything smelled polished and expensive. Marble floors, giant digital displays, employees carrying tablets and laptops while discussing algorithms Ethan still understood better than most of them probably did. But none of that mattered anymore. His job was simple. Clean floors, empty trash cans, stay invisible. New guy? A heavy-set supervisor barked from across the lobby. Ethan nodded. Yeah. Name? Ethan Cole. The supervisor barely looked up from his clipboard. You work nights, 43rd through 50th floors. Don't touch anything in the server rooms. Don't talk to employees. Don't slow down. Ethan nodded again quietly. Understood. The man handed him a mop bucket and key card. And if anybody asks, you were never here. Ethan almost smiled at that. Invisible again? Perfect! By midnight, the building had mostly emptied except for scattered engineers working overtime. Ethan moved silently through hallways lined with glass offices, cleaning coffee stains and wiping fingerprints from conference tables worth more than his car. His lower back burned with pain, but he ignored it. Every hour here meant food on the table. Every paycheck meant medicine for Lily. That thought alone kept him moving. Around 1:20 a.m., Ethan entered one of the upper executive floors carrying fresh trash bags when he suddenly heard shouting coming from a nearby conference room. The system keeps corrupting the recovery packets, someone snapped angrily. We've rewritten the architecture 3 times. Another voice fired back. Then explain why the synchronization failures are multiplying. Ethan froze instinctively. Through the glass walls, he saw 6 exhausted engineers gathered around giant monitors filled with code. Complex network structures rotated across the screens. Error reports flashed red continuously. Ethan tried not to look too long, but his eyes automatically began analyzing the data anyway. Old instincts. Dangerous instincts. He lowered his head and continued mopping the hallway, yet fragments of the conversation kept reaching him. If we don't stabilize the AI defense grid before Friday, Reed's losing the Pentagon contract. We're already out of time. Ethan's grip tightened slightly on the mop handle. AI defense grid. Synchronization failures. Packet corruption. Even without seeing the full architecture, he could already sense something fundamentally wrong underneath their design. The realization disturbed him more than it should have, because for the first time in years, the sleeping part of his brain, the engineer he buried after Emily died, began waking up again. He hated that feeling, hated how naturally the patterns still came to him, hated how part of him still wanted to solve impossible problems. That version of Ethan Cole had destroyed his life once already. He couldn't afford to become that man again. Not now. Not when Lily needed stability more than brilliance. Ethan forced himself to keep walking. But a moment later, one exhausted engineer stormed out of the conference room and threw a stack of printed reports directly into the trash bin Ethan had just emptied. Papers scattered across the floor. Unbelievable, the engineer muttered before disappearing down the hallway. Ethan sighed quietly and knelt to pick them up. Most were useless diagnostics, but one page caught his attention instantly. A synchronization loop map. Ethan's eyes narrowed. There it was. A flaw hidden deep inside the packet recovery structure. Small, almost invisible, but catastrophic under heavy load conditions. Ethan stared at the page for several long seconds while rain battered the windows behind him. His heart began pounding harder. He knew this problem. Worse, he knew how to fix it. Suddenly, his phone vibrated in his pocket. Ethan answered immediately. Daddy? Lily's voice sounded weak and frightened. Ethan stood instantly. Lily, what's wrong? I can't breathe very good. Pure panic shot through his body. Use the inhaler, baby. I did, but it hurts. Ethan was already running toward the elevators. Stay on the phone with me. I'm coming home right now. Outside, freezing rain crashed onto the streets as Ethan sped through traffic with shaking hands gripping the steering wheel. Every red light felt like torture. Every second stretched forever. By the time he burst into the apartment, Lily was curled up on the couch, struggling for air. Ethan dropped to his knees beside her instantly. Hey, look at me, he whispered, trying to stay calm while terror ripped through him internally. Slow breaths. Lily clutched his arm tightly, tears streaming down her face. Ethan grabbed the nearly empty inhaler and realized with horror there was barely anything left. Not enough. Not nearly enough. He looked toward the kitchen counter where unpaid medical bills sat stacked beside the rent notice. Then back at his daughter, gasping for breath in his arms. Something inside him broke quietly in that moment. Because no matter how hard he worked, no matter how many hours he sacrificed, it still wasn't enough to protect the only person he had left in the world. Ethan held Lily against his chest as dawn slowly crept through the apartment windows, and for the first time in years, the defeated genius buried deep inside him began whispering something dangerous again. Maybe survival wasn't enough anymore. Ethan Cole did not sleep after Lily's attack. He sat beside her bed for the rest of the morning while weak gray sunlight filtered through the cracked blinds of the apartment. Every few minutes he checked her breathing again, unable to stop himself. The inhaler rested in his hand like a ticking clock, almost empty. One more serious attack and he didn't know what he would do. Hospitals cost money they no longer had. Medicine cost money. Even hope seemed expensive now. Lily finally drifted into a deeper sleep around 8:30, exhaustion overcoming the fear in her small body. Ethan brushed his fingers gently across her forehead before quietly standing up. His joints ached immediately. He was running on maybe 3 hours of sleep across 2 days, but exhaustion had become normal long ago. What frightened him more was the thought that he was beginning to feel numb to it. He walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. Half a gallon of milk, eggs, a few slices of bread. That was all. He stared at the nearly empty shelves while the silence of the apartment pressed down around him. Then his eyes shifted toward the old laptop sitting on the counter beneath a stack of unpaid bills. The screen was cracked near one corner. One hinge was broken and held together with black tape. It looked like junk. But inside that dying machine lived fragments of the man Ethan used to be. For 3 years, he had avoided opening certain folders buried deep in its hard drive. Research files, old code structures, advanced network simulations, entire worlds he once built with his mind before life tore everything apart. He hated looking at them now because they reminded him of everything he failed to protect. Emily, their future, himself. But this morning was different. Because for the first time in years, his brain refused to let go of a problem. The synchronization loop at Blackridge Dynamics kept replaying in his head like a voice whispering in the dark. Ethan slowly sat down and opened the laptop. The machine struggled awake with a loud mechanical hum. He typed carefully, fingers hesitating over the keyboard for the first time in months. Then he recreated the structure he had glimpsed on the discarded report the night before. Node architecture, recovery routing, packet redundancy. He worked silently for almost an hour while rain continued tapping against the windows. The deeper he went, the more disturbed he became. The flaw was worse than he originally thought. Blackridge's engineers weren't just facing random crashes, their entire synchronization framework was fundamentally unstable under adaptive AI load conditions. Every recovery cycle unintentionally corrupted clean packets because the system kept rewriting its own backups recursively. It was a design flaw hidden beneath millions of lines of otherwise brilliant code, small enough to evade detection, fatal enough to destroy everything. Ethan leaned back slowly. How did they miss this? He muttered under his breath. Then he answered his own question almost immediately. Because nobody was looking in the right direction. Modern engineers trusted automation too much. They relied on simulations instead of instinct. Ethan had always been different. He used to see patterns the way musicians heard melodies. Structures spoke to him. Systems revealed themselves in layers most people never noticed. Years ago, people called it genius. Now it just felt like a curse he could never fully escape. Suddenly, the screen flickered as another overdue electricity warning popped up in the corner of the desktop. Payment past due. Final notice. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Reality crashed back into him all at once. He wasn't an engineer anymore. He was a janitor trying to keep his daughter alive. None of this mattered. He shut the laptop quickly and rubbed both hands over his face before getting ready for another endless day. By the time Ethan returned to Blackridge Dynamics that night, exhaustion sat heavy in every step he took. The giant skyscraper glowed against the Chicago skyline like a monument built for people far more successful than him. Employees in expensive coats crossed the lobby, carrying conversations about investments, AI infrastructure, and market expansions, while Ethan pushed a cleaning cart through the marble entrance unnoticed. Invisible again. Yet something had changed inside him since the previous night. Now, every screen he passed pulled at his attention automatically. Every technical discussion caught pieces of his focus before he forced himself away. He hated it, because deep down, part of him missed this world more than he wanted to admit. Around midnight, Ethan entered the 46th floor and immediately sensed tension in the air. Engineers crowded around several workstations while giant monitors displayed endless diagnostics across the walls. Nobody looked relaxed. Coffee cups covered nearly every desk. Some employees looked like they hadn't slept in days. Then Ethan noticed the man standing at the center of the room, Nathaniel Reed. Even from a distance, the CEO carried a presence impossible to ignore. Tall, controlled, sharp-eyed. The kind of man who looked dangerous even while standing still. Ethan recognized him immediately from business magazines years earlier. Nathaniel Reed had built Blackridge into one of the most powerful tech companies in the country before turning 45. Investors called him a visionary. Competitors called him ruthless. Tonight, he looked furious. "I'm done hearing excuses," Nathaniel said coldly to the engineering team. 6 months. 6 months and nobody can stabilize this system." Silence filled the room. Ethan kept his head down while emptying trash bins nearby, but he listened carefully. "The Pentagon review is in 72 hours, Nathaniel continued. "If this AI fails again during live demonstration, the contract disappears, along with half this company." One engineer swallowed nervously. Another avoided eye contact completely. Then a man with slicked-back hair stepped forward confidently. Derek Vaughn, lead systems director. Ethan recognized the type immediately. Brilliant enough to succeed, arrogant enough to destroy everyone around him. "We're close," Derek insisted. "My team identified another possible source inside the neural redundancy chain." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Wrong again. Nathaniel stared at him with growing impatience. "You said that last week." Derek forced a thin smile. "This time it's different." Ethan continued mopping silently while his mind instinctively dismantled every word coming out of Derek's mouth. They were chasing symptoms instead of the cause. The redundancy chain wasn't the origin point. It was only where the corruption became visible. Nathaniel finally exhaled sharply. "Fix it," he said flatly before walking away. The room immediately exploded into tense conversation again. Ethan moved toward the far hallway, but as he passed one workstation, he caught sight of live synchronization metrics on screen. His eyes froze instantly. There. A recursive loop spike hidden inside packet recovery timing, exactly where he predicted. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. Without realizing it, he stopped walking completely. "Hey!" The sharp voice startled him. Ethan looked up instantly. Derek Vaughn stood nearby, staring at him with annoyance. "You planning to clean the floor or study the monitors all night?" A few engineers laughed quietly. Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. "Sorry." Derek smirked dismissively. "Trust me, you wouldn't understand what you're looking at anyway." Ethan nodded once and walked away without responding, but the words lingered longer than they should have. Not because they hurt, because once upon a time Ethan had said almost the exact same thing to someone else. Back when he was young and arrogant and convinced brilliance made him untouchable. Funny how life corrected people. Around 2 a.m., Ethan found himself alone cleaning a dark conference room overlooking the city skyline. Rain streaked across the massive windows while distant thunder rolled above Chicago. He should have focused on work. Instead, his thoughts kept drifting back toward the system failure. Finally, unable to resist anymore, Ethan approached the digital glass board mounted on the wall. He glanced toward the hallway once. Empty. Slowly, he picked up a stylus. Then he began writing. Just small notes at first. Packet recovery timing adjustments, synchronization offset corrections. But once he started, the ideas flowed out uncontrollably. Equations, structures, entire routing modifications. Ethan's breathing changed as old instincts awakened fully for the first time in years. He wasn't cleaning anymore, he was solving. For 10 straight minutes, the forgotten engineer inside him came back to life. Then suddenly footsteps echoed outside the room. Ethan froze instantly. Panic hit him like cold water. He erased everything off the board in seconds and grabbed the mop just as 2 engineers walked past laughing about deadlines. Ethan's heart pounded violently long after they disappeared. What the hell was he doing? This was dangerous. The moment people discovered who he used to be, questions would follow. Questions led to the past. And Ethan never wanted to revisit the ruins of the man he once was, because the truth was uglier than anyone knew. Years earlier, Ethan Cole had not simply disappeared from the tech world. He had walked away after one catastrophic mistake destroyed everything. His startup, Nexagrid Systems, had once been worth hundreds of millions. Investors praised him as one of the most gifted systems architects of his generation. Interviews, conferences, headlines. He lived inside a world fueled by ambition and obsession, until the night he chose work over family one final time. Emily had begged him not to leave for San Francisco that weekend. Lily was sick. Emily was exhausted. But Ethan insisted the investor meeting was too important. Just one more trip, he promised her. After this deal closes, everything changes. But while Ethan sat inside a luxury hotel negotiating contracts, Emily collapsed at home from complications doctors had failed to catch in time. By the time Ethan returned, she was already gone, and something inside him died beside her. He never forgave himself for not being there. The company collapsed months later after Ethan stopped caring whether it survived. Investors abandoned him. Friends disappeared. The tech world moved on quickly, just as it always did. And Ethan let it, because punishing himself felt easier than rebuilding. Now, standing alone in the dark conference room at Blackridge, Ethan stared at his reflection in the glass. Tired eyes, worn clothes. A janitor carrying secrets nobody around him could imagine. Somewhere beneath all that ruin still lived the man capable of building extraordinary things. But Ethan no longer knew whether that was a gift or a curse. Then his phone buzzed softly. A message from Lily. "Daddy, did you eat dinner tonight?" Ethan stared at the screen for several seconds before smiling sadly to himself. Even now, she worried about him. He typed back quickly. "Of course I did, Peanut. Go back to sleep." 3 dots appeared immediately. "Love you." Ethan swallowed hard before replying. "Love you more." He slipped the phone back into his pocket and slowly picked up the mop again. But as he walked through the glowing hallways of Blackridge Dynamics, one terrifying realization refused to leave his mind. The company's system was getting closer to total collapse. And unless someone understood the flaw hidden deep inside its architecture, disaster was coming fast. Ethan already knew he could stop it. The real question was whether he was willing to become Ethan Cole again. By the end of Ethan Cole's second week at Blackridge Dynamics, he had learned something dangerous about invisible people. Everyone talked freely around them. Executives revealed confidential frustrations while walking past him in hallways. Engineers argued openly beside him while he emptied trash bins. Nobody lowered their voices because nobody considered the janitor important enough to notice. Ethan kept his head down and listened quietly while the pressure inside the company grew worse every night. The Pentagon deadline was now less than 3 days away, and Blackridge's AI defense system continued failing unpredictably during stress simulations. Entire departments were beginning to panic. Sleep-deprived engineers snapped at one another constantly. Managers blamed lower teams. Lower teams blamed infrastructure. Every floor carried the same atmosphere now, fear hidden beneath expensive suits and forced confidence. And at the center of that fear stood Derek Vaughn. Ethan noticed quickly that Derek ruled the engineering division through intimidation more than respect. He humiliated junior developers publicly whenever mistakes appeared. He interrupted meetings aggressively. He spoke about people the way investors spoke about defective products. The man radiated arrogance from every movement. But beneath that arrogance, Ethan sensed something else growing stronger each day: desperation. Derek was losing control of the problem, and everyone knew it. Around midnight one Thursday, Ethan pushed his cleaning cart into the executive engineering floor and immediately heard shouting coming from the central operations room. "Run the simulation again," Derek barked furiously. "We already did," a younger engineer replied nervously. "The recovery cycle still collapses under adaptive load." Derek slammed both hands against the desk hard enough to make several employees flinch. "Then fix it!" Silence followed instantly. Ethan moved quietly along the hallway, pretending not to listen while wiping fingerprints from the glass walls. But his eyes drifted toward the giant monitor displaying live network behavior. The same recursive corruption pattern appeared again near the lower synchronization channels. Ethan felt frustration tightening in his chest. They were wasting precious time patching surface-level failures while the core flaw kept poisoning everything underneath. He tried looking away. He truly did. But the longer he stared at the architecture, the more unbearable it became watching talented people attack the wrong problem. "You!" Ethan looked up immediately. Derek stood near the doorway, staring at him with visible irritation. "What are you doing standing there?" Ethan lifted the spray bottle slightly. "Cleaning." Derek narrowed his eyes. "Then clean faster." Several engineers glanced toward Ethan briefly before returning to their screens. Nobody said anything. Nobody ever did. Ethan nodded quietly and continued working. "And stop staring at the monitors," Derek added coldly. "You wouldn't understand a damn thing you're looking at." The room chuckled softly again. Ethan kept moving without responding, but something dark shifted behind his eyes for a split second. Not anger. Worse. Recognition. Years ago, Ethan himself had once believed intelligence determined human value. Back when he was successful, he used to dismiss people constantly without even realizing it. Assistants, drivers, custodians, ordinary workers fading into the background of his ambition. Losing everything had taught him the brutal truth about men like Derek Vaughn. The higher they climbed, the less human they became. 20 minutes later, Ethan entered a smaller conference room overlooking the city skyline. Empty coffee cups and printed diagnostics covered the massive table. He began cleaning silently until he noticed several pages of handwritten notes left behind near one laptop. Ethan tried ignoring them. Then one diagram caught his eye instantly. His heartbeat slowed. Someone on the team had finally started approaching the real problem, not completely, but closer. Ethan glanced toward the hallway once before carefully examining the notes. The engineer had correctly identified unusual packet duplication during recovery cycles, but misunderstood why it happened. Ethan's mind automatically began correcting the equations internally. If the synchronization offset were adjusted dynamically instead of recursively, "What the hell are you doing?" Ethan jerked backward instantly. Derek stood in the doorway again, fury spreading across his face. Ethan stepped away from the table immediately. "I was just cleaning." Derek stormed into the room and snatched the papers away from him. "You think this is funny?" Several nearby employees turned toward the commotion. Ethan lowered his voice carefully. "I wasn't touching anything." "Then why were you reading confidential engineering reports?" Derek demanded loudly. The entire hallway grew quieter now. Ethan could feel eyes turning toward him from surrounding workstations. I wasn't trying to cause problems. Problems? Derek laughed harshly. You mop floors for a living. Stay in your lane. The words hit harder than Ethan expected. Not because they were cruel, because part of him feared Derek was right. Maybe this was his lane now. Maybe this was what remained after genius failed. Derek stepped closer, lowering his voice dangerously. Listen carefully. I don't know what game you think you're playing, but if I catch you near my team's systems again, I'll have security escort you out personally. Understood? Ethan nodded once. Understood. Derek stared at him another second before walking away. The moment passed quickly. Engineers returned to work. Conversations resumed. But something uncomfortable lingered afterward. A few employees had noticed the way Ethan looked at the diagrams. One junior developer even frowned slightly, as if confused by something she saw in his reaction. Ethan immediately kept his head lower for the rest of the night. Yet no matter how hard he tried to disappear again, he could feel the walls shifting subtly around him. And somewhere above everyone else, Nathaniel Reed had started paying attention too. The CEO first noticed Ethan 2 nights later during another failed stress simulation. It was nearly 1:30 a.m., and Nathaniel had been awake for almost 30 hours straight. The pressure from Washington was becoming unbearable. Investors were panicking. Board members demanded explanations every few hours. If Blackridge lost the defense contract now, the company's valuation would collapse overnight. Nathaniel stood inside the elevated observation office overlooking the engineering floor, while Derek presented another useless recovery strategy below. Nathaniel barely listened anymore. He trusted results, not confidence. And lately Derek only delivered speeches. Then something unusual caught Nathaniel's attention. The janitor. Ethan stood near the far hallway changing a trash bag, but unlike everyone else in the room, he wasn't staring at the flashing error warnings. He was staring at the synchronization graph itself, not casually, intently, like someone analyzing it. Nathaniel narrowed his eyes slightly. Most people saw chaos on those screens, but the janitor's expression looked disturbingly focused. Then Ethan quietly shook his head to himself, almost disappointed. Nathaniel noticed immediately. Interesting. Minutes later, another catastrophic failure hit the system. Red alarms flooded the room again. Engineers erupted into frantic movement while Derek began shouting orders across the floor. Nathaniel watched everything silently from above until his eyes drifted back toward Ethan. The janitor had frozen near the hallway, staring directly at the corrupted synchronization metrics. And for one brief second, Ethan unconsciously mouthed something under his breath. Wrong layer. Nathaniel couldn't hear it clearly through the glass, but he read the words from Ethan's lips. Wrong layer. Nathaniel's expression changed slightly. How would a janitor even know enough to say that? Down below, Derek suddenly exploded at one of his engineers. I said isolate the redundancy channels. We already tried that, the younger developer fired back desperately. Then do it again. The room descended into chaos. Ethan quietly resumed mopping the floor, but Nathaniel kept watching him now instead of the engineers. There was something deeply strange about the man. Not just intelligence, restraint. Most people desperate for attention found ways to speak. Ethan did the opposite. He looked like a man actively trying not to reveal himself. That intrigued Nathaniel more than brilliance ever could. Meanwhile, Ethan felt the pressure becoming unbearable internally. Every night he watched the same mistake repeated while the company moved closer to disaster. And every night the engineer buried inside him screamed louder. He started seeing solutions everywhere now, in reflections on glass walls, in network charts flashing across monitors. Even while riding elevators between floors, his brain unconsciously rebuilt Blackridge's architecture piece by piece. He hated it because solving problems used to feel exhilarating. Now it only reminded him of the life he lost. Around 3 a.m., Ethan entered an empty supply room to retrieve more cleaning chemicals. The moment the door closed behind him, exhaustion finally cracked through his composure. He leaned both hands against the shelf and lowered his head heavily. His reflection stared back at him faintly through the metal cabinet door. A brilliant systems architect hiding inside a janitor's uniform. A father barely surviving. A broken man pretending he no longer cared about the world he once dominated. Then his phone buzzed softly. A message from Lily appeared on screen. "Can't sleep. Miss you." Ethan stared at the text for several long seconds before typing back. "Miss you too, Peanut. Get some rest for me, okay?" Her reply came almost instantly. "Are you fixing computers tonight or cleaning again?" Ethan froze completely. Even after all these years, Lily still remembered fragments of who he used to be. He smiled sadly before answering. "Just cleaning tonight." But after sending the message, Ethan looked down at his own hands and realized something terrifying. For the first time in years, that answer no longer felt completely true. The collapse came at 2:11 in the morning. Blackridge Dynamics' entire AI defense network suddenly spiraled into catastrophic failure during the Pentagon's live simulation review. Red alarms exploded across every floor. Screens flashed error after error while engineers shouted in panic. One by one, the company's backup servers began crashing exactly the way Ethan feared they would. Derek Vaughn barked orders desperately, but nobody could stop the corruption spreading through the system like a virus. Millions of dollars, years of work, and the future of the company were seconds away from disappearing forever. Then, the final server failed. Silence hit the room like a bomb. "We lost synchronization," someone whispered in horror. "The entire network is dying." Nathaniel Reed stood frozen inside the operations center, staring at the collapsing architecture on screen. Around him, the best engineers in the building looked defeated, broken, helpless. And then Nathaniel saw Ethan standing near the back wall holding a mop in one hand, while watching the failure unfold with heartbreaking certainty in his eyes. In that moment, Nathaniel finally understood the truth. The janitor had known all along. "Ethan," Nathaniel said sharply. The room turned instantly. Derek frowned in disbelief. "Sir?" Nathaniel never looked away from Ethan. "Can you fix it?" The question hit the room like thunder. Several engineers actually laughed nervously. Derek stepped forward immediately. "This is insane. He's a custodian." But Nathaniel's voice turned cold. "And you're out of solutions." Silence. Ethan stood completely still while dozens of eyes locked onto him. For a brief second, fear crossed his face. Not fear of failure, but fear of becoming the man he used to be again. Then he thought about Lily struggling to breathe in their freezing apartment. He thought about every promise he made to her. Slowly, Ethan set the mop aside. "Move," he said quietly. Nobody spoke as Ethan walked toward the central terminal. Derek stared at him with open contempt while the exhausted engineers stepped aside. Then Ethan's fingers touched the keyboard and everything changed. Code flew across the monitors at impossible speed. Ethan rebuilt synchronization pathways in real time, rerouted corrupted recovery loops, and rewrote entire sections of architecture from memory while the room watched in stunned silence. Within minutes, the collapsing servers stabilized one by one. Red warning signals turned green across the entire operations wall. The AI network rebooted perfectly. Complete silence filled the room before someone whispered, "Oh my God." Nathaniel stared at Ethan with disbelief and recognition finally colliding together. "You're Ethan Cole," he said quietly. "Nexagrid Systems." Ethan lowered his eyes slightly. Derek's face went pale instantly. The legendary systems architect he had mocked for weeks had been cleaning floors beside him the entire time. The next morning, Nathaniel gathered the entire company in the executive atrium. Hundreds of employees stood silently as Ethan appeared wearing the same janitor uniform from the night before. Nathaniel stepped forward calmly. "Last night, this company was saved by a man most of you never even looked at twice." The room grew still. Nathaniel turned toward Ethan. "Talent does not care about titles. Genius does not disappear because life becomes difficult." Then, in front of everyone, he announced Ethan Cole as Blackridge Dynamics' new chief systems architect. Derek Vaughn was removed from leadership that same morning. But the moment that mattered most happened hours later inside a small hospital room. Lily sat in bed clutching her inhaler when Ethan walked in, wearing a clean suit for the first time in years. "Daddy?" she whispered with wide eyes. Ethan smiled as tears finally filled them. "I fixed it, Peanut." Lily threw her arms around him instantly, and for the first time since losing Emily, Ethan no longer felt like he was surviving. He finally felt like he had come home,